Hello and welcome to Studio Time. My name is Roman DeSimone and today we're talking about recording drums. This demo was made here in Studio A at Staten Island Community Television, but you can apply these same principles to almost anywhere you decide to record. Our drummer today is Nick Borgstrom from Cinema 23, a pop-punk band from South Jersey. Nick is very talented and easy to work with, but my favorite part of recording with Nick is that he has no problems following the directions and advice of the recording engineer, which in this case was me. That's something you definitely can't take for granted. So let's dive right into it and take a listen to this recording. We'll run through the raw recording, then the mixed recording, and a rough mix with a demo version of the song. Let's take a listen. Alright, so overall I'm really happy with the recordings we got. There was a bit of bleed between microphones, but nothing that I couldn't handle, and the tracks were very cooperative in the mixing stage. So now let's break down the recording process. The first, and arguably most important thing to consider when recording drums is to make sure the drummer is playing on time. If the drums are not recorded at the correct tempo, or the drummer does not play according to the tempo, the final mix will be a disaster. It's the responsibility of the drummer to keep time, so all of the other instruments can stay in time. Some drummers are extremely good at this, others not so much. In this case, Nick is great at keeping time, but when I'm recording drummers, I always make them record to a metronome, sometimes called a click track. This is not a choice when recording with me, because playing to a metronome is a surefire way to stay on time and in tempo. Tracks in time are always good tracks. Now let's check out the microphones. First up is the Shure SM57 on the snare. There are dozens and dozens of fantastic options for miking up a snare drum, but I'll pick the 57 every time. It's sturdy and reliable, but most importantly, it has a relatively flat frequency response, meaning that all of the frequencies produced by the snare drum are captured at volumes that are extremely close to those produced by the drum itself. With such a neutral color, tracks recorded by the 57 become very workable platforms for mixing and adding effects later on. Toms, cymbals, and overheads, I'm using several Sennheiser E835s. They are not my first choice, nor my second, nor my third, but they are what is available to me. Truth is, I happen to think they sound pretty good on drums. Although they were designed to be vocal mics, I think that they require too much gain and don't have enough high-mid frequency response. So in short, I don't like them. However, I do actually like using them as overhead mics. In this application, they sound pretty clear and pick up almost the whole kit. As tom mics, they get the job done. This might be an unpopular opinion, but I find the toms to be the least important part of the drum kit. I usually wind up EQing them heavily anyway. For the kick drum, I'm using an Audix D6. I like the D6 because it really allows me to capture the bottom end of the response of the drum without losing any of the upper frequency content. That's important because even though a kick drum is a bass drum, it's really the upper frequency smack that makes it stand out in a mix. I put a heavy blanket over the drum there just to dampen the sound a little bit. For some of the extra cymbals, I used an Audio-Technica AT822 stereo mic. This mic allows me to kind of cheat and capture a few of the cymbals on 2 channels while still only using 1 microphone. I think I had basically run out of microphones by this point. I used a Sennheiser E935, which is very similar to the E835 on the kick beater and the snare bottom. I don't always mic up these parts of the kit, but I figured the tracks might come in handy. Finally, I used 2 MXL V63M microphones as room mics. Room mics are used to capture how the drum kit sounds in the room, how the different frequencies interact in the acoustic space at a given distance. So I placed one between the drum kit and the rear wall, and one at the very back of the room. We'll listen to some examples later. Let's move into the mixing phase now. We're going to cover just the basics. Starting with the kick drum, the first effect I have applied is an EQ, but we're going to skip that for a minute and go right to the second effect here, which is the gate. The gate's job is to keep the track quiet until a signal of a certain volume threshold is present. So if you listen here, you can see that even though Nick is playing a full kit, we can only hear the kick drum and the snare. So let's take a listen. We don't hear the cymbals because they are not loud enough to open the gate. Now obviously I didn't want the snare in there, but right now it is loud enough to open and get through my gate. So I'll either have to make my gate more aggressive or manually delete the snare hits. So back to the EQ. You can see here that I've taken a more is more approach. The bass drum is a low frequency instrument, so I've boosted the lower frequencies here by quite a bit. I've also increased the treble frequencies by quite a bit as well. Now you might be thinking, why do that? You just said the bass drum is a low frequency instrument. It is, but in order to bring it front and center to get it to cut through the mix, we need to bring out the higher frequencies coming from the spot where the beater meets the drum head. This snappy smacking sound is where the initial attack of the instrument comes from. The feeling of the instrument comes from the bottom end. Let's take a listen, first without and then with the EQ. Obviously this is an extreme example, but I apply these principles anytime I am mixing bass drums. While we're here, I'll quickly go over my compressor settings. This is a more advanced compressor, so I'm not going to go too in depth, but suffice it to say I'm compressing a fair amount, that is making the quiet bits louder and loud bits quieter, but I'm attempting to do so as transparently as possible. You can see here that the attack time of my compressor is set to about 12 milliseconds. Making the attack time too long is going to make your kick drum sound weak and lifeless, but setting the compressor to respond too quickly will also have the same effect. So we want to preserve the drum's natural attack from the beater. So I normally aim for about 5 to 15 milliseconds. Finally, on this track I have this cool little plugin called XCTR. What this is, it allows me to discreetly add distortion to different parts of the instrument's frequency spectrum. A little bit of distortion in the low end and in the high end can really help a kick drum stand out in the mix. Let's move on to the snare now. Same principles apply for gaining and compression, but the EQ is different now since we're dealing with a different kind of drum. For the snare, I again want to hear just the good parts. I don't really need that much low end, so I'm rolling that off here, or actually shelving it off here, but I do want some low mids. That's where the body of the drum is. Typically we're talking in the 200 Hertz range, but I like the way the snare sounded with a boost at about 100 Hertz. I'm attenuating the mids here a little bit, and finally I'm boosting the treble response to get a little more pop in there. When it comes to cymbals, I typically only use compression if I really have to. Gates are a must though, because the only thing I want to hear on a cymbal channel is a cymbal. You can spend hours and hours and hours EQing cymbals to make them sound the way you want, but all I typically do is raise the higher frequencies a bit, and usually I cut basically all of the lower end response just because we don't need it. You know, these are cymbals, they don't have all that much lower end response. I will occasionally scan for what I call problem frequencies. These are frequencies that just plain don't sound all that good. And all you have to really do with those is eliminate them. So let's listen for a problem frequency now, see if we can find one. Yeah, so I'm not really liking the way this particular frequency sounds, so we're just going to crush it right at about almost 2K here. Cool. With the overhead cymbals, we're going to take everything we did with the equalizers on the previous tracks and sort of apply them all at once here. This is going to give us a pretty even representation of the drum kit as a whole. I do occasionally compress overheads, but not by a crazy amount. Finally, the room mics. As I mentioned earlier, I use these for capturing how the drums sound in the room they were recorded in. However, they can also be manipulated to an extreme degree, giving you a variety of different creative possibilities. In this instance, I'm heavily attenuating the frequencies that I feel I've already covered in previous parts of the kit. And I'm leaving the ones that I think could use a little bit of extra representation. Finally, I'm using some reverb just to help the kit breathe a little bit. Now you may have noticed that my drum tracks aren't actually routed to my main outputs. Instead, they're going to bus 2. This is my drum bus, and I'm using it to make last-minute changes to my drum mix as a whole, before sending it to my main stereo output. The drum bus is where you make the finer adjustments, small tweaks to equalization, and just a little bit of compression to kind of glue the whole thing together. Let's take a listen without the final touches on the drum bus and then with them. So the difference is very subtle, but the main idea is that the kit sounds now just a bit more controlled. The drum bus is also where you can do some crazy things to your drums from a creative/instrumental standpoint. For example, we can distort it like crazy with this bit crusher here. We can do something like pitch shifting, or we can even add a flanger. Possibilities here are endless. So there you go, there's the basic rundown of how to record and mix drums. If you're interested in some of the more advanced concepts of drum recording, leave a comment and let me know. Until next time, I'm Roman, and I'll see you later.